Until very recently, Australia didn't have a federal anti-corruption body, unlike every state and territory. Different models had been proposed, but the Liberals and Nationals made sure that nothing was passed while they were in power. But that changed when Labor won the 2022 federal election. As an election promise, Anthony Albanese had said that they would introduce a federal anti-corruption body as a priority.
We will legislate this year a National Anti-Corruption Commission. It will be a National Anti-Corruption Commission with teeth.
And to Labor's credit, that's what they did. The Parliament passed what was called the National Anti-Corruption Commission Act, establishing the NACC.
I'll put the question. All of those opinions say aye. Aye. Against no. I think the ayes have it.
But is Labor's model any good? This video is a deep dive to answer that question. Labor has for years outlined what its anti-corruption model would look like, something it's called the design principles. This made it clear that if elected, it would seek to introduce a body with wide reach and strong powers. Even though this plan was only 2 pages long, these design principles were a good sign. When Labor won the election, they started work on putting together what the actual legislation would look like. And in September 2022, the bill was first introduced into Parliament.
Today I bring to the Parliament a bill to establish a powerful, transparent and independent National Anti-Corruption Commission.
In an attempt to seem like they were taking a multi-partisan approach across Parliament, the legislation was referred to a specially created committee called the Joint Select Committee on National Anti-Corruption Commission Legislation. Very catchy name. Anyway, this committee was basically a group of politicians from different parties that came together to review the NACC model. They heard from experts and then wrote a report with recommendations of how the model could be improved. The committee's report was released in November 2022.
Today, Dr Helen Haynes, the member for Indi and the Deputy Chair of the committee, tabled its report in the House. I thank her and the Chair, Senator Linda White, and all of the members of the committee for their work on this report. I'm delighted that the committee, made up of government, opposition and crossbench members of both houses, has delivered a unanimous report today. This is the Parliament at its finest, with members and senators coming together to find common ground and to find a constructive way forward.
The messaging from Labor was that everyone had agreed with the model, with only a few recommendations made through this unanimous report. And this was very deliberate language, because that's how the headlines were then written. But this was a marketing stunt, trying to sell us a story where everyone across the political spectrum worked with Labor to come up with the ideal anti-corruption model. In reality, that wasn't the case. The coalition members of the committee were arguing throughout the report that the anti-corruption body should be weakened, while the Independent and Greens members were arguing that it should be strengthened. You see, Labor played this really well. They made Independent member Dr Helen Haynes the Deputy Chair of the committee. Now, Helen Haynes had already introduced her own anti-corruption bill into Parliament in the past, which was widely supported by experts. The Morrison government had made sure it went nowhere. So Labor making her the Deputy Chair of the committee was good for optics. But far from a unanimous view, Independent Helen Haynes and David Shoebridge from the Greens consistently disagreed with elements of Labor's model. What they failed to do was write what's called a dissenting report, which is where committee members who don't agree with the main report write an additional section with their own recommendations. This happens all the time, but for some reason, the crossbench didn't do it. This meant that despite the disagreements, which we'll run through in a second, Labor was able to hold up a final report and say that the committee had unanimously agreed to their model and recommendations. In other words, the crossbench got played. To be clear, the NACC as it's been legislated has a lot of good features. It will be able to take referrals about potential corruption from anyone. It will be able to investigate on its own without a referral. It will be retrospective. And it will be able to hold public hearings, and will have the ability to publish findings of corruption. These are all things the coalition model wouldn't have been able to do. So what are the issues with Labor's model? This is by far the biggest issue. The law says that the default position is for hearings to be held in private. The Commissioner can then decide to hold the hearings in public instead, but to make that decision, the Commissioner needs to be satisfied of two tests. First, that there are exceptional circumstances to justify holding a public hearing, and second, that it's in the public interest to do so. We'll come back to these two tests a bit later, but having the option to hold public hearings is really important. It allows us to see what's going on. It encourages more witnesses to come forward, and it's a deterrent for future corruption. But don't take my word for it. Here is the New South Wales ICAC Commissioner explaining his view.
Could you please state your full name and capacity in which you appear before the Commission?
John Hatsis, Chief Commissioner, Independent Commission Against Corruption in New South Wales. I'm a strong supporter of public hearings. I believe that they're important because they make the organisation accountable. They provide an opportunity for other people to come forward. We've had investigations which have commenced in public, and as a result of that information, other people have come forward and we've been able to go into other areas which have raised significant issues of corruption. It also, I think, ensures transparency.
So let's get back to the two tests that the NACC Commissioner will need to consider before holding public hearings. The public interest test is fine. It provides a safeguard so that factors like undue reputational damage and future court proceedings are taken into account. This is similar to what the New South Wales ICAC model has in place. The problem is with this additional test, the exceptional circumstances requirement. This is taken from the Victorian IBAC model, which is the Victorian Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission. This model is known for its lack of transparency. Legal experts were baffled that the exceptional circumstances clause was included in the federal legislation, especially given that this test didn't appear in Labor's design principles that we were looking at earlier in the video. Those design principles only mentioned the public interest tests, so it's no surprise that expert after expert said that the exceptional circumstances test should be removed. Professor Anne Twomey, a constitutional law expert, said that this test would create a very high hurdle and that it can confidently be predicted that almost all hearings will be in private. She also said that this will undermine public trust in the NACC and is inconsistent with the principles of transparency. Leading anti-corruption advocates agreed with this position. Bodies like the Accountability Roundtable, the National Integrity Committee, the Centre for Public Integrity, and Transparency Australia. These are organisations made up of countless law professors, judges, and other integrity experts. They said that the exceptional circumstances test would be a roadblock and restrict the Commissioner's independence to make the right call that's in the public interest. Even the Victorian IBAC gave evidence to the committee. In their submission, they said that there is no need for the legislation to require exceptional circumstances to exist prior to public hearings being held. Remember, Victoria is the state that has this restrictive test in place, so we should be listening to their experience. The IBAC Commissioner also appeared in front of the committee.
Yes, I'm the Commissioner of the Victorian Independently Based Anti-Corruption Commission.
Would you agree that the requirement of exceptional circumstances, given what you've just been talking about in the IBAC Act and what's proposed in the National Anti-Corruption Commission, is a significant departure from the Australian norm regarding public hearings in integrity bodies?
As the debate has indicated, I'm not sure that there is a norm, but I think there is a very strong body of opinion that purposes of investigation of corruption are better served if, wherever possible, it's subject to the two protections that I've mentioned, namely no reputational damage that's unreasonable and no damage to welfare. If those conditions can be satisfied, that the investigation of corruption is better served by public exposure. There is no comparison between the public's interest and understanding of integrity issues is substantially enhanced by a public hearing. And conversely, when matters are dealt with in private, distrust arises in relation to the way in which the issues have been managed, and often public confidence in the integrity agency is also lost. And unfortunately, in Victoria, in relation to a number of our private investigations, there has been so much public debate about the processes that we have followed in private, none of which has been either fair to the Commission or to the individuals involved.
I thought I'd point out that the Coalition wasn't too happy that this witness was advocating for public hearings, and there was this odd interaction with a Liberal Party member.
Thank you, Commissioner Redlich, for your submission and for making time to appear before us. I'm not sure if you heard the New South Wales Commissioner's evidence.
Yes, I did. I listened.
He said it is not his role to act as a commentator or analyst on federal issues, yet you have taken a different view, despite being in the same position in Victoria. Why do you think it is appropriate for you to weigh in on that issue and on the federal questions before this committee?
Well,
I'm going to take one further objection. My understanding is this committee invited IBAC to make a submission and invited IBAC to make a submission on the bills. It was a resolution of this entire committee. So to challenge this witness for responding to our own invitation is, I find it an extraordinary proposition. And again, I think it's out of order. We invited this witness to make this submission.
Mr Redlich is busy, is going to be here till past, and I think going backwards and forwards about political matters when there are substantive matters of law and the way in which it operates, our time would be better spent interrogating that than talking about
I'm happy to move on, Chair.
So if you could confine your questions, but bearing in mind you've spent a number of your minutes arguing about this.
I don't really cover off the Coalition's arguments in this video, and now you know why. They don't seem to be approaching this discussion in good faith, and in my view, they ended up misrepresenting expert evidence in the report to somehow support their own points. Back to public hearings though, I do want to make something clear. Sometimes there may be good reasons why hearings need to be done in private. But the suggestion that without the exceptional circumstances test, all hearings will be done in public is ridiculous. Remember, the New South Wales ICAC doesn't have an exceptional circumstances test, and yet the majority of its hearings are still done in private.
If you look at the extent of what we do hearings, about 40% of the hearing time, just over 40% actually, is done in public.
But despite Helen Haynes and David Shoebridge arguing that experts thought the exceptional circumstances test to be unnecessary, the committee report still said this. On balance, the committee considers that the current thresholds for public hearings strike the right balance. In other words, the views of the crossbench committee members were disregarded. So here's the mystery. Remember that earlier in the video, we went through Labor's pre-election design principles, which they said their model would be based on. Those design principles made clear that the threshold for public hearings would be a public interest test. It didn't have an additional exceptional circumstances threshold. So where did the exceptional circumstances requirement come from? The crossbench committee members tried to find out by asking the Attorney General's Department, who were the people who drafted the legislation.
At what point in the drafting was the exceptional circumstances test added to the test for public hearings?
We need to take that on notice.
Could you explain why it was necessary then, in addition to the in the public interest clause?
Yes, so the addition of exceptional circumstances to the threshold for holding a public hearing, I think, was directed at a threshold that met that balance between making corruption issues transparent in appropriate circumstances, but recognising the significant issues that public hearings might create with unfair damage to reputations, potential risk to criminal prosecutions in matters, and that the practice has been that they are a much smaller subset of hearings that are held. So it was very much recognising that and making sure that there was an appropriate balance
Could I ask you first of all, I think, Ms Chidgey, you said in your opening that the intent of the bill was to implement the design principles, the NACC design principles that the government took to the election?
That's right.
Yep. Well, I mean, I've got a copy of the design principles here and it's nice and colour-coded, but under public hearing it says the NACC will have the power to hold public hearings where the Commission determines it's in the public interest to do so. Now, that's not what the bill provides. So, can you explain why the department deviated from the design principles in the drafting of the bill?
So I wouldn't describe it as a deviation. We've added to those design principles a further requirement of exceptional circumstances.
But if the Commission determines it's in the public interest to have a hearing, but there aren't exceptional circumstances, the Commission can't have a public hearing under this draft. And you'd agree, wouldn't you, that's a significant deviation from the design principles?
I think it builds on those design principles to add to them, and it was included for the reasons I've outlined previously.
Well, it doesn't build on them, does it? It greatly restricts the instances where the Commission thinks there's a public interest, but because of those additional limitations in the bill, it actually restricts the circumstances which in a public hearing can happen. It's not a building, it's a tearing down and restriction, isn't it?
I wouldn't describe it as such. So it's for the Commission to determine, but can consider the public interest and then also determine whether there are exceptional circumstances having regard to a range of factors.
You said in response to Dr Haynes that you'd provide on notice when those instructions came to put in the additional threshold of exceptional circumstances. You're not in a position now to identify when that happened?
No.
Are you able to explain to the committee where those instructions came from to put that additional restriction on?
The Attorney General had asked us about adding that as part of the threshold.
Instead of coming back with a response to these questions, the Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, filed a public interest immunity claim. This prevented the department from telling the committee why the exceptional circumstances test was included at the last minute. This move is straight out of the coalition playbook. Saying that there's a public interest in keeping this stuff secret is nonsense, and it's a real shame because I normally have good things to say about Mark Dreyfus. And when you look into this, it's not hard to figure out what actually happened here. When Labor was putting together the NACC legislation, the Liberals all of a sudden didn't seem so opposed like they had been previously. Peter Dutton was openly saying that the coalition was in talks with Labor about the model. And then there was this press conference.
We've conducted discussions and negotiations with the government over a period of time. I want to thank the Prime Minister and the Attorney General as well for the way in which they've been able to engage.
Did you lobby for the exceptional circumstances threshold for public hearings?
Well, as I said, we've had discussions with the government which have been conducted in good faith. I'm not going into the detail of what the government said was their position or what they argued back and forth. We had a sensible discussion with the government, and I've got a good relationship with the Prime Minister on a number of issues. It's in our national interest that that's the case, and I'm not going into the detail of those discussions.
It looks like Labor did a secret deal with the coalition to water down the NACC in return for their support. This is even though they would have had the support of the crossbench and easily had the numbers to pass the bill through Parliament. And it's even more ludicrous that despite publicly praising all the good work by the independents in this process, they've actually listened to the coalition more than those independents. Labor will argue that it was seeking a multi-partisan approach, something that would be supported by the entirety of the Parliament. Now this makes some sense, because if all the parties support it, then in theory it will be harder for future governments to change things. But we have to be honest, the coalition did whatever it wanted to do when it was last in power, and doing deals about integrity with the party of no integrity doesn't make any sense. All that we've seen from them taking on the coalition's input as opposed to the crossbench is a NACC that is weaker. Not that you'd know any of this if you listen to Labor MPs in Parliament. Just listen to these politicians parroting the party line that apparently the NACC will have the same powers as a royal commission.
The Commission will have a full suite of powers similar to those of a Royal Commission, so in essence there will be a permanent standing Royal Commission into corruption at the Commonwealth level. That is a sentence I love to read, Deputy Speaker.
Clearly, this isn't the case, especially with the restrictions on public hearings. But if you say something enough times, people might just think it's true.
The Commissioner will have a full suite of powers similar to those of a Royal Commission.
The Commissioner will have powers similar to the Royal Commission.
The Commission will have the powers of a Royal Commission.
To stamp out this behaviour, the Commissioner will have a full suite of powers similar to those of a Royal Commission.
The Commissioner will have the full suite of powers, akin to those of a standing Royal Commission.
Have these people actually read their own legislation? Because from what I've seen of Royal Commissions, they conduct their work in the public eye. Julian Hill here continues with an interesting comment.
Now, it's been amusing and instructive to watch the hyperbole and hypocrisy of much of the media on this question, as they earnestly proclaim everything must always be conducted in public, and that to not do so is to cover up corruption. Well, this is nonsense. Now, we've seen in recent weeks in the Victorian election how incomplete inquiries can be weaponised effectively.
What's nonsense is that he's bagging out the Victorian ICAC, and yet his government has taken on that very model. And now that we have more background, even speeches by the Prime Minister start to have obvious flaws.
Another key part of the Commission's independence has to be ensuring that the decision as to whether a hearing is held in public is a decision that rests entirely in the hands of the Commissioner. That's the point.
But it's not entirely in the hands of the Commissioner. The Commissioner is instead hamstrung by two tests set out by the Parliament.
And that is the way in which best practice should operate. Contrary to some of the comments that I've heard about the New South Wales ICAC, the Independent Commission Against Corruption. According to the ICAC's own report, just 3.5% of its hearings were public in the 2021 financial year. 3.5%. And yet, if you look at some of the commentary made, you would think that every hearing of the ICAC is held in public. It is not. It is not.
The figures are about 40%, but the point still stands. The majority of New South Wales ICAC's hearings are done in private. So if he's pointing to the New South Wales ICAC and saying how it has enough safeguards in place, then why wasn't that model adopted? Why was the Victorian model adopted instead? I'm highlighting all of these misleading claims because it's important that Labor is properly scrutinised. The coalition is a complete joke, and weak oppositions allow for the governing party to get away with more. I'm not saying Labor and Liberals are the same. They're not, and if you've seen my series on the Liberals' approach to anti-corruption, then that would be clear. But this stuff detracts from Labor's attempt at being a more mature and honest government, and it's a real shame. Apart from the issues of public hearings, there were other areas of the NACC that the crossbench members disagreed on. Things like the fact that the report with corruption findings might not always be made public, or the fact that pork barrelling might not be covered by the NACC's jurisdiction, or that funding might not be adequate, and that the appointments process of NACC staff didn't have appropriate safeguards. On each of these, the views of the crossbench were disregarded in favour of Labor's own position. So much for a unanimous report. Let's put aside the committee report where the crossbench was sidelined, because luckily there was a second chance to consider their views. When the legislation was finally being passed in Parliament, there was an opportunity to pass amendments. In particular, Helen Haines introduced amendments to strengthen the NACC. This was one of them, to remove the exceptional circumstances test.
Amendment 5 will strike out the unnecessary and alarming exceptional circumstances requirement. In my mind, this is the single most important change to this bill. My amendment will ensure that the Commissioner may decide to hold public hearings if the Commissioner is satisfied that it will be in the public interest.
The government will not be supporting this amendment.
The amendment was voted down. Here is Labor and the Liberals voting against it. And here you have the Greens and most independents voting for it. Notably, one coalition member did actually vote with the crossbench, and that was Liberal Party member Bridget Archer. Then there was this amendment to make sure that pork barrelling was covered by the NACC's jurisdiction.
Mr Speaker, these amendments are really important. They put beyond doubt that pork barrelling falls within the definition of corrupt conduct when it meets the threshold of being serious or systemic.
It's not necessary to amend the bill to expressly cover conduct of this kind. The government does not support this amendment.
Before we get to the vote, here's an interesting contribution to this amendment from someone in the coalition, seemingly out of nowhere.
In relation to this amendment, I find the member for Indai's amendment quite frankly offensive. I spoke about this last night in my own speech. I'll leave it on record with there, but I certainly won't be supporting your amendment. Thank you.
A very bizarre contribution, and honestly, I'll spare you what he said previously on the matter. Again though, the amendment failed, with Labor and the Coalition voting against it. Now that we know what happened with the NACC, earlier comments by Labor start to seem a bit off.
I want to single out the member for Indai, who was a consistently strong voice on this throughout the last term of the previous government. And I pay tribute to all those who participated in the joint cross-party parliamentary committee as well, which came out with unanimous recommendations. This government has a majority in the House of Representatives, but we've sat down and collaborated across the parliament with anyone who has wanted to engage with us on these issues.
Except Labor didn't really collaborate much with the member for Indai, Helen Haines. Her concerns were ignored by the committee in their report, and her amendments were rejected. Instead, the real collaboration was done in the shadows with the Coalition. My thoughts with all this are mixed. It can't be ignored that we now have a federal anti-corruption body that will apparently be operational quite soon, from mid-2023. And overall, it is a decent model, and a world apart from what the Coalition was trying to fleece us with. But the process Labor went through has left us with a weaker and less transparent watchdog. Time will tell how effective this body ends up being. Thanks for watching. This is a video I've been working on for a while, and if you enjoyed it and want to support the channel, then check out my Patreon page, link is in the description.